Hey friends, it's Alex here, and before we begin, I wanted to let you know that I'll be giving out premium holographic stickers to each and every single listener that rates the podcast 5 stars wherever they're listening from now until the end of February. That's right, all you have to do is send me a screenshot of your rating along with the best mailing address to my email at darklyspeakingpodcast@gmail.com, or feel free to DM me on TikTok and Instagram at darklyspeakingpodcast. Thank you all so much for being here, and back to the show. There was a cluster of mysterious disappearances that unfolded in the southwestern region of Vermont within the span of a single decade. 6 people vanished under different circumstances, in different locations, at different times. Of those 6, only 2 bodies were ever recovered, and even then, the discoveries raised more questions than answers. On its own, that concentration of vanishings was unsettling enough to draw national attention. It's what ultimately gave the region its name. But the disappearances are only part of the story. What happened to those 6 individuals and what continues to happen in this area is a question people have been trying to make sense of for decades. Welcome back to an all-new episode of Darkly Speaking. My name is Alex Kern, and if you're joining us for the first time, well, you found your way to a podcast of true crime, dark history, and unexplained phenomena. I release new episodes every Monday on chilling and unsettling stories from the world of true crime to the eerie realms of the paranormal. I also release video episodes each week on Spotify and YouTube. Last week, in part 1, we walked through the history of the region and the string of disappearances that coined the term the Bennington Triangle. If you haven't watched part 1, I'd recommend going back and starting there because, well, tonight, we cross into the other side of the story. The murders, the sightings in the sky, the reports of something moving through the woods, and the moments where people describe reality itself feeling unstable. These events don't happen all at once, and they don't belong to a single decade. They appear years apart, along the same roads and ridgelines in the same stretch of land. Maybe seeing it all side by side will help us understand what this place has been trying to tell us all along. Maybe it brings clarity to what happened to the people who vanished here, or explains why so many unsettling events seem anchored to this landscape. Or maybe it leads us somewhere else entirely, to the unsettling realization that some places aren't meant to be understood, some tragedies have no answers, and some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Seen one by one, the disappearances tied to the Glastonbury mountain region can feel isolated, tragic, but explainable within the context of each individual life. Mental illness, disorientation, accidents, exposure, human error. Each case offers at least one plausible explanation when viewed on its own, and none of them require anything extraordinary to understand. But when those cases are placed side by side, the explanations begin to thin. Not because they prove a single cause or suggest a clear connection, but because they share conditions that are difficult to ignore. 6 people vanish within a relatively short span of time, all tied to the same stretch of southwestern Vermont. They differed in age, background, and circumstance, yet each story ended the same way, with unanswered questions. Of the 6 cases most often associated with what came to be known as the Bennington Triangle, only 2 bodies were ever recovered. And even those recoveries offered little clarity about what actually happened. As for the disappearances themselves, well, timing, terrain, and human behavior can account for pieces of each story. Taken together, however, those explanations begin to strain, not because they're impossible, but because they no longer feel sufficient on their own. James Tedford's disappearance can be understood, at least in part, through the realities of his life. He was a World War I veteran living in a soldier's home, struggling with mental illness and clearly uncomfortable within institutional care. He wasn't reported missing for an entire week. In that stretch of silence, ordinary failures have time to take hold. Disorientation, neglect, the kind of quiet unraveling that often goes unnoticed until it's too late. What makes Tedford's case so unusual is that his disappearance doesn't hinge on isolation or hidden terrain. It unfolds in plain sight. He steps off a bus in broad daylight, surrounded by other passengers, and is simply never seen again. It's possible he left Bennington and attempted to start over somewhere else, or that his disappearance was shaped by his mental illness and the lingering trauma of war. While unresolved and deeply tragic, there are explanations rooted in ordinary human vulnerability that don't require anything supernatural or even criminal. But for the sake of argument, there's another layer that complicates that conclusion. Dozens of witnesses claim to have seen Tedford on the bus en route to Bennington. There were even statements alleging that he had been sleeping, his head resting against the window, and that at some point, before the bus arrived, he was suddenly gone. These accounts suggest that Tedford was definitely on the bus, and then he wasn't. His luggage and coat were still on his seat. Nothing appeared disturbed. He had simply vanished en route. So whether we believe that Tedford quietly stepped off the bus at some point, or accept the more unsettling version that he disappeared while still on board, there's an undeniable eeriness about his case. Even the most reasonable explanations leave behind a sense that something still doesn't quite line up, and that lingering uncertainty is what continues to trouble his disappearance. Paul Jepson's case also allows for grounded possibilities. Reporting at the time described him as mentally disabled, and at least one newspaper suggested he had wandered off before, though that claim can't be traced back to any reliable source. He was last seen at a working town dump, a place defined by routine labor and livestock, not a remote or hidden stretch of wilderness. His mother was nearby and left him alone for only about half an hour. When search dogs were brought in, his scent trail led away from the dump and stopped at an ordinary roadside intersection. That detail alone opens several possibilities. There could have been an opportunistic predator in the area who abducted Paul. There's also the possibility that curiosity took hold and he wandered deeper into the surrounding wilderness. Either way, the circumstances point toward explanations rooted in human behavior and situational vulnerability, even if none of them account for what ultimately happened to him. Frida Langer's disappearance appears to offer the clearest resolution, or at least it does at first glance. While hiking near Glastonbury Mountain, she fell into a narrow brook, soaking her clothes in cold conditions, became separated from her cousin, and attempted to make her way back to camp as daylight began to fade. Months later, her body was recovered just a few miles away from where she was last seen, in an area that had already been extensively searched. Investigators found no evidence of foul play, though an official cause of death couldn't be determined due to the advanced state of decomposition. It's a tragic outcome, but one that aligns with the risks posed by the terrain and the season. Cold exposure and disorientation could very well explain how Frida died. What's more difficult to account for is how far she managed to travel beyond her last known location, and why repeated searches failed to locate her sooner in ground that had already been thoroughly covered. That gap doesn't negate the most reasonable explanation, but it does complicate it. Disorientation and exposure may explain Frida's death, but they don't fully explain the path she took or why she remained hidden for so long. And that leaves open the possibility that something else, however subtle, played a role. The remaining 3 cases are even more difficult to explain, beginning with Carl Herrick. Carl went missing for 3 days before his body was discovered in an area he had previously said he would be in. His death was officially ruled a hunting accident. He had been squeezed to death, suffering catastrophic internal hemorrhaging. At first glance, it's easy to imagine a tragic lapse in judgment. Carl was an experienced hunter, moving through land he knew well. One might picture a moment of miscalculation, approaching too closely, assuming an animal was down, setting his rifle aside, a brief decision that ended badly. But while Carl's body was recovered, the scene itself raises questions that don't resolve cleanly. The injuries were severe enough to break his ribs and puncture a lung, suggesting crushing force rather than a straightforward attack. If an animal was responsible, most often assumed to be a black bear, that explanation brings its own set of complications. Predatory bear attacks on humans were extremely rare at the time, with only one fatal bear attack recorded in Vermont in the 1940s. That attack was Carl Herrick's. And notably, there were no signs of feeding or mauling. Aside from a few non-fatal scratches on his arms, hands, and face, there were no external wounds consistent with how such an attack typically unfolds. But again, for the sake of argument, let's assume Carl made a fatal error. The weather was cold and snowy, he believed the bear was down, he set his rifle aside, propping it against a nearby tree, and approached. The bear suddenly got up and attacked him. Even then, the mechanics of that scenario don't fully add up. If the bear didn't maul him, then how did it kill him? Well, the official explanation is that the bear squeezed him to death. The injuries suggest crushing rather than tearing. However, the most plausible version of this explanation would be that the bear charged, Carl fell backward, and the animal stomped on him repeatedly, causing the internal damage that ultimately killed him. Yet, even that version raises further questions. If the bear attacked, why didn't it feed? Black bears are typically already hibernating during this time of year, and when they do leave their dens, it's usually in search of food. So why stop short? Why leave no feeding evidence at all? No matter how this story is reconstructed, no matter which explanation is applied, something about Carl Herrick's disappearance and death resists easy categorization. What remains is a set of facts that doesn't fit neatly into what we expect, whether animal, human, accident, or something else entirely. And that unresolved tension is what continues to make his case so difficult to dismiss. Mitty Rivers disappears under circumstances that feel even less forgiving. He vanished from woods he had hunted for decades in a heavily populated area threaded with trails, roads, and familiar routes. Search efforts were extensive, yet nothing turned up. Until months later, when a single blue handkerchief appeared in a location that should have guided him back toward help, not carried him farther away from it. The prevailing belief is that Mitty became disoriented and lost, or that he suffered some kind of medical event that prevented him from returning to camp. But what continues to trouble his disappearance is what's missing. There is no body, no clear direction of travel, no identifiable misstep that explains how a man so familiar with the land simply vanished. And finally, there's Paula Weldon. Paula leaves campus for what she tells friends will be a short hike. Nothing out of the ordinary, nothing that suggests that she doesn't plan to return. Later that afternoon, witnesses report seeing someone matching her description along Route 9. Others claim sightings as far away as Massachusetts, though none of those reports can be definitively confirmed. What's striking is how closely Paula's movements appear to align with exactly what she said she intended to do that day. Investigators consider everything from an accident on the trail to outside involvement, but the search turns up nothing that clarifies her fate. No belongings are missing, no physical evidence is recovered. Paula Weldon is never seen again. I will say this, I wish there had been more sustained reporting on the incident involving John Bush. In part 1, we talked about the possibility that Paula may have been seen with a man driving a blue coupe. A witness claimed to have seen a woman matching Paula's description, sitting in the passenger seat of a blue coupe that investigators later determined belonged to a man named John Bush. John was confirmed to have been in the area where Paula was last seen, and it was also alleged that he had told friends earlier that day that he had a date with a beautiful blonde. What bothers me most about this account is how quietly it disappears. There is very little follow-up reporting, no clear resolution, and no indication that this lead was ever meaningfully pursued beyond those initial mentions. It simply fades from the record. The other account that we discussed, and the one that appears more closely aligned with what may have happened, comes from contractor Lewis Knapp. Knapp reported picking up a hitchhiker matching Paula's description near Bennington College shortly before 3 p.m. He recalled that she was quiet, that she asked whether the road led toward Route 9, and that she said that she was trying to reach the long trail. He dropped her near Furnace Bridge, and within minutes, she was gone from view. A few weeks later, a couple discovered small sneaker prints in the snow off of a roadway along Route 9, consistent with the type of shoes Paula was known to be wearing. The tracks can be followed for several hundred yards before stopping abruptly, as if she stepped into a vehicle or simply vanished at that point. Another report came from a woman living near the route, who said she noticed similar tracks behind her house. If those prints did belong to Paula, then a troubling pattern begins to emerge. There are at least a dozen reported sightings placing her near the long trail on the afternoon she disappeared. Beyond those sightings, we have a witness who claims to have given her a ride toward the trail physical tracks appearing along that same route, and the earlier report of Paula being seen in a blue coupe, possibly traveling as far as Massachusetts. Taken together, the witness statements, sightings, and limited physical evidence suggest that Paula was likely heading toward Route 9 near the Long Trail, which today forms part of the Appalachian Trail. What we don't know is whether she ever actually began her hike. We don't know what happened next, and if the hitchhiking account is accurate, it raises another unsettling possibility that she may have entered a second vehicle somewhere near Route 9. The alternative is that she reached the Long Trail and became lost, injured, or disoriented shortly after. Once again, we are left with the same unresolved reality. No body, no clear evidence, and no definitive indication of where Paula Weldon went next. Individually, each disappearance offers a set of circumstances that can be examined and named. But the distances involved, the gaps in time, and the absence of any consistent physical evidence leave behind an uncertainty that never fully resolves, and it's that uncertainty that continues to haunt these vanishings. So if these weren't simply accidents and they don't sit comfortably within traditional ideas of foul play, then the question that follows becomes unavoidable. What else was happening here? To understand that, there's another reality about this region that has to be acknowledged. People didn't only disappear in this landscape. Beyond the vanishings, there is a documented history of violence, murders with names, dates, and victims, events that ground the mystery in lived experience rather than speculation. That's where we're headed next, because the Bennington Triangle isn't shaped by disappearances alone. It's shaped by everything that happens to people within this land, whether they vanish without a trace or whether they meet violent ends and are left behind. Southwestern Vermont has long carried a broader reputation, one that extends beyond disappearances, to include reports of unidentified flying objects, cryptid sightings, and repeated claims of portals and time slips. Places where people believe the rules shift, where reality doesn't behave the way it should. I'm not here to dismiss those ideas. I don't rule out the possibility that cryptids, UFOs, or even portals could exist, or that one might exist somewhere in these forests. But before any of that can be considered, there's a more grounded question that has to come first. Disappearances aren't the only thing this region is known for. Some people didn't just vanish here. They were killed. People do get lost in the woods, accidents happen, weather changes quickly, and unfamiliar terrain can disorient even experienced outdoorsmen. A single wrong turn can become dangerous in a matter of minutes. Between 1945 and 1950, at least 6 people vanished without a trace in and around this region. Dense forest, limited witnesses, very few bodies ever recovered. When you step back and look at that timeline, the same question inevitably follows. Are these cases connected? The most immediate answer many people reach for is a human one, the idea of a serial killer operating in these woods. On paper, the landscape almost seems built for it. Remote terrain, difficult navigation, vast stretches of forest where someone could move unseen, where evidence could be lost, concealed, or never recovered at all. If someone were committing repeated acts of violence, this is a place where it might go unnoticed. But that theory begins to unravel under closer scrutiny. There are no consistent signs of foul play across most of the core disappearance cases. The victims don't share a clear profile. Men and women, children and adults, different routines, different circumstances, different outcomes. And it's difficult to reconcile the idea of a single person committing that many perfectly concealed crimes without leaving behind a clearer pattern or trail. As compelling as the explanation might seem, it doesn't hold up. And yet, this landscape is no stranger to violence. Long before the Bennington Triangle entered public consciousness, a killer moved through these same woods, leaving behind victims, not vanishings. If you rewind the timeline into the 1800s, the historical record thins quickly. What survives is fragmented and incomplete, missing details, blurred names, and dates. Even so, certain patterns emerge. Loggers and mill workers who vanished without explanation, reports of strange noises carrying through the woods at night, and a persistent sense among those who lived and worked there that something about this place was off. In 1864, a charter was granted to build a railroad, capable of climbing more than 1,300 feet of elevation and under 9 miles, cutting a steep line from Bennington through Woodford Hollow. With it came an influx of laborers, the rise of temporary camps, and the kind of instability that follows rapid expansion in remote terrain. Logging operations intensified, mills multiplied. Men arrived expecting hard work, short stays, and little attachment to the land or to one another. At the end of that improbable rail line, a settlement took shape: South Glastonbury. It cycled through industries in quick succession, logging timber, harvesting ferns, firing charcoal, catering to tourists, and, eventually, murder. Violence entered the record. After that, the town began to empty. Industry faded, people moved on, and South Glastonbury receded into what it remains today, a ghost town, marked not just by abandonment, but by what happened there before it was left behind. By the early 1890s, Fayetteville existed almost entirely for work. It was a loose sprawl of logging camps pressed tight against the dense forest, built to serve the mills and little else. Men came for timber and wages, stayed only as long as the trees held out. Days were long and punishing, measured in labor and exhaustion. Nights closed in inside crowded camps, thick with noise, drink, and a kind of tension that never fully burned off. This was the height of industrial expansion in southern Vermont. Bennington and Glastonbury pushed aggressively for railroads, mills, and mining operations, and temporary labor camps rose just as quickly to meet the demand. The men who filled them were known as jobbers, transient by design, brought in to build, to log, and to disappear as soon as the work moved on. John Crowley was one of those jobbers, a laborer working the mills and rail lines cutting through southern Vermont. He lived, as most of the men did, close to his coworkers, sharing space, tools, and grievances in an environment where work and rest bled into one another. Another jobber living in Fayetteville at the time was 38-year-old Englishman William Conroy, who also went by the name Henry McDowell. He had come to know the area only a few years earlier to work as a mill hand, and by the early 1890s, people around the camps had begun to notice him. Strange sounds carried out of the woods at night. McDowell spoke of hearing voices, not once, but often enough that it unsettled those around him. On April 4th, 1892, the voices overwhelmed him. They were loud and repetitive, pressing the same command into his mind again and again. After work that day, he drank heavily, trying to quiet them through exhaustion or alcohol. But it didn't work. By nightfall, the camp was tight with tension, especially between McDowell and Crowley. Words were exchanged, authority was asserted. In the tight, volatile atmosphere of the logging camp, the argument swelled. As it did, the voices grew louder, pushing him forward. McDowell grabbed a sled stake, described as either wood or stone, and struck Crowley again and again. When Crowley collapsed, he didn't stop. The voices told him to keep going. The blows were brutal. Blood spattered across McDowell's face and boots. Crowley was bludgeoned to death there in Fayetteville. McDowell ran, still covered in blood. He fled south toward Connecticut. Along the way, other crimes may have followed, though the trail breaks apart. 10 months later, he was captured in South Norwalk in connection with another crime. He confessed and wept in front of a jury, breaking down as he spoke about the voices that had driven him. A grand jury in Bennington County indicted him, and he was returned to Vermont, committed to the Vermont State Asylum, nearly 120 miles from Bennington. And then, somehow, he was gone. McDowell escaped. It's believed he hid inside a coal-filled railroad car, rode it back toward Bennington, and when the train slowed, slipped off and vanished into the surrounding woods. From that point on, the story fractures. William Conroy, Henry McDowell, was never seen again. Some locals believed McDowell survived by slipping deeper into the Bennington woods, setting up camp far from roads and settlements, living where the forest closed in on itself. Over time, those accounts darkened. Stories took on a life of their own, and legend began to take hold. In those tellings, McDowell stopped being human. He became an enduring presence, something that moved through the mountains, hunting, haunting, feeding, and vanishing back into the trees. There were never any confirmed sightings, no proof, That version of events belongs firmly to folklore. What remained was fear. And 5 years after Crawley's death, violence surfaced again. It's September 30th, 1897. Early autumn has settled over the woods outside Woodford and Bickford Hollow. It's a cool, clear day. The only sounds are of water moving through nearby brooks, birds chirping, and leaves flying through the wind. The sun peeking through rows of trees, leaving a faint golden glow over the landscape. It's the first day of deer season when 40-year-old John Harper sets out to hunt with his brother, moving through terrain they've walked countless times before. As they move deeper into the forest, they drift apart, each taking a slightly different line through the trees. They stay close enough that it doesn't feel dangerous and the forest still seems manageable. Then, the quiet breaks. A gunshot cracks through the trees, sharp and sudden, echoing against the hills. There's sound of birds flocking into the sky all at once. Almost immediately, it's followed by a gut-wrenching scream. The sound cuts through the woods and stops just as abruptly as it began. Harper's brother runs toward it, breath burning in his chest, branches snapping against his coat as he pushes through the undergrowth. He expects to find John just ahead, wounded, startled, calling out. But the woods give nothing back. No movement, no voice, no trace of where the sound came from. Only the rustle of leaves settling back into place, the forest closing in on itself. John Harper isn't found until the following morning. By then, the light is different. Pale, filtered, cold. His body lies beneath a tree, miles from where the two men had been hunting the day before. His rifle is propped beside him, fully loaded and untouched. The ground around him is disturbed and paint a horrifying picture. John's body had been dragged several yards from where he was shot to where he would later be found. His cause of death is believed to be a gunshot wound. Despite the fear it stirred at the time, no suspects were ever identified, and John Harper's murder slowly faded from public memory. And once again, the explanations splintered. Some wondered if there was a killer moving through the woods. Others asked whether Henry McDowell had ever truly left them. And some believed the answer had nothing to do with a single person at all, that it was something bound to the land itself. By the early 1900s, logging companies began to withdraw from the region. Camps were dismantled, work stalled, towns like Fayetteville and Glastonbury slowly emptied, their buildings left behind to rot where they stood. People spoke quietly of too many murders, too many unexplained vanishings, too many stories of voices and movement carrying through the trees. Bennington endured at the edges, but the heart of the triangle went silent, hollowed out long before the disappearances that would later make it infamous. The stories didn't stop. They accumulated. Screams heard at night, groans drifting through the trees, voices that seemed to carry too far, too clearly for empty woods. People began to say the forest remembered, that it held on to what had happened there or to those who had died within it. One story begins in the 1940s. A traveler moves through the triangle and comes upon mountaineers living deep in the mountains, far from towns, far from roads. They invite him inside their homes, give him food, and offer him a place to rest. When the night settles in and the fire burns low, they show the traveler what they've done. The mountain people drugged 4 men and 2 women. They stripped them of their clothing and left them outside in the freezing cold until their bodies slowed and their vital signs faded. When that happened, the mountaineers sealed them inside wooden boxes and buried them alive beneath the snow. They believed winter would preserve them, and when spring returned, so would life. The traveler leaves at first light, and when he returns the following spring, all 6 people were alive and well, reborn again. This story lives firmly in the realm of legend. It's difficult to prove whether there's any actual truth to it. But it clings to this region all the same, retold because it fits too neatly with what people already felt about these mountains. And whatever was happening here, whether carried by men, memory, or the land itself, it didn't end in the past. In 2019, the remains of Jessica Hildebrandt, a New York resident, were discovered near Somerset Reservoir, a quiet, remote stretch of water set deep within the same southern Vermont landscape that has framed so many of the cases that came before. Her death was officially ruled a homicide, and the investigation remains ongoing. Almost immediately, people in the area began drawing uneasy comparisons, not because the circumstances mirrored the past exactly, but because the location did. Another violent death tied to the same geography, surfacing long after the earlier cases were thought to belong to history. Murder explains part of the triangle's history, but not all of it. Violence is real here. So are disappearances, and it's that unresolved tension that keeps some people anchored to human explanations while others begin to look beyond them. Because this area has also long been treated as a hotspot for sightings in the sky, which is where this story goes next. Up to this point, every explanation we've explored has stayed rooted in human behavior. Violence, error, neglect, the ways people hurt one another or disappear through circumstance. But the history and mystery of this region doesn't stop there. For decades, locals and researchers have pointed to something else entirely, something that doesn't involve, well, humans, really. Another explanation runs alongside the disappearances in unsettling ways: sightings in the sky. In part 1, we talked about a local historian and author named Joseph Citro, who coined the term Bennington Triangle, deliberately invoking comparisons to the Bermuda Triangle, a defined geographic area associated with repeated unresolved phenomena. And he was careful to clarify that the vanishings were only one piece of a much larger picture. He became the first person to publicly suggest that the disappearances might share a supernatural explanation. More importantly, he argued that these events weren't isolated incidents scattered across time, but occurrences tied to a specific place. And it was during this conversation that he gave the region a name. According to Citro, the Bennington Triangle has long been considered a hotspot for UFO sightings. Reports of unexplained lights in the sky stretch back centuries, with accounts predating European settlement of the area. Across generations, people described strange illumination moving above the ridgelines, lights that didn't behave like stars or aircraft appearing and disappearing suddenly. One of the most detailed modern encounters unfolded in 1968, on a quiet night deep in the Vermont woods. 2 teenagers had pitched a small campsite beneath a dense canopy of trees. The forest around them felt alive in the way it often does after dark. Insects humming in the underbrush, leaves shifting high above their heads, the distant call of night birds moving through the ridgelines. Their campfire burned low but steady, its smoke curling upward with the sharp scent of pine sap and damp soil clinging to their clothes and hair. The ground beneath them was soft with needles and moss, the air cool enough to raise goosebumps when the wind slipped through. They lay near the fire, talking lazily, laughing a little too loudly. The woods answered back with sound. Crickets, branches snapping somewhere in the dark, the quiet rush of wind moving through the trees. And then, without warning, it all stopped. The insects fell silent. The wind dropped away. Even the fire seemed to dim. The forest didn't gradually settle into silence, it cut off all at once, abrupt and absolute. So still, they could hear their own breathing. It was in that unnatural silence that something finally felt wrong enough to demand their attention. The woods went unnaturally still, and both of them froze with it. Breath shallow, every sense suddenly sharpened. Neither of them spoke. They just looked at one another, a wordless exchange as the weight of the moment settled in. They scanned the darkness around them, listening for anything at all. But the silence held. It felt as though the forest itself had turned its attention on them. Something was watching. Then, just above the tree line, they saw it. A pale light suspended in the air. Hanging over the treetops was a long, narrow object stretched out horizontally, unlike any aircraft they recognized. It was cigar-shaped, silent, and impossibly steady, with a transparent dome rising from its surface. They watched in silence as this thing hovered above them. 3 smaller craft detached from the underside of the larger object, emerging one by one and drifting into view with controlled precision. And inside the dome, they could see movement. A figure standing within. As they were staring up into the night, They heard a voice inside their minds and instinctively understood it belonged to the figure they were seeing. The message was simple and calm. The beings meant no harm. They were not there to hurt anyone. They were only visiting. Then, a sudden flash of intense light filled the clearing. Both of them lost consciousness where they stood. When they came to, the forest was quiet again. The craft were already rising above the tree line, pulling away from the campsite and disappearing into the night sky as if they had never been there at all. After 1968, reports in the region became more frequent, though less detailed. Fewer close encounters, fewer figures or craft descriptions. Most accounts focused instead on glowing lights and moving orbs drifting across the sky, sometimes hovering, sometimes darting away at impossible speeds. These reports raised a larger question. If UFO activity repeatedly concentrates in the same region as the disappearances, is something drawing them there? And UFOs are not the only anomaly associated with this landscape. The triangle has also become linked to cryptid sightings and other unexplained encounters. Here, the threat seems to change shape, at times rooted in human violence, at other times suggesting something beyond it. Serial killers, strange lights, and unexplained events all coexist in the same narrow stretch of wilderness. Which raises an unsettling thought. Not every threat tied to the Bennington Triangle is something seen in the sky. Some are said to be large, wild, and pure evil, moving through the forest itself, living among all of us. And that belief leads directly to the next legend tied to this place, the Bennington Monster. Alongside records and investigations, there has always been something else attached to this place. Tales rooted in the land itself. Ones that follow the trails, the mud, and the edges of the forest. That's where the story of the Bennington Monster enters this landscape. It's the early 1800s, and a stagecoach winds its way along a forested route near what we now know as Glastonbury Mountain. The air is cold and damp, the trees pressed tight on both sides of the road. Inside the coach, passengers talk quietly among themselves, shifting in their seats as the wheels grind through ruts and stones. Leather creaks, horses snort. It's an ordinary journey through an unforgiving landscape. Then, the road gives way. The coach lurches hard and sinks, its wheels swallowed by thick, heavy mud. The horses strain against their harnesses, hooves slipping as the driver reins them in. The carriage doesn't budge. What little conversation there was inside falls away as the driver climbs down to see what's gone wrong. He lifts his lantern, the weak glow barely cutting through the fog, revealing only a few feet of road at a time. As he moves the light slowly around the carriage and the ground beneath it, something else comes into view. The tracks. Pressed deep into the mud around the stalled wheels are enormous footprints. Not boot prints, not horse tracks, something else entirely. They're far too large to belong to a person, and the distance between each impression suggests whatever made them moved with long, powerful strides. Before the driver has time to think through what he's seeing, the woods answer for themselves and the tree line erupts. From the darkness comes a creature, 6 to 8 feet tall, moving upright on its hind legs, its body covered in thick black hair that blends into the forest around it. It charges the stagecoach with startling speed and slams into the side hard enough to tip it over, wood splintering as the carriage collapses into the mud. A roar follows, loud, raw, and unmistakably animal, echoing through the trees before the figure disappears back into the woods as abruptly as it emerged. There's no chase and no sign of injury left behind, just the overturned coach, the ground torn apart by the impact, and those massive footprints pressed deep into the road, marking the path of whatever crossed through and vanished again. When people hear this story now, the comparison comes easily. It sounds like Bigfoot, a giant, hairy ape-like figure moving on 2 legs, leaving huge tracks and announcing itself with a roar. But that isn't the name locals use. In this part of Vermont, the story isn't borrowed from somewhere else. The figure has its own name, the Bennington Monster, because people believed that what they encountered belonged to this place. The stagecoach encounter remains the most detailed account, but it isn't the only one. Sightings continue to surface across decades, spaced far enough apart to feel disconnected, unless you're paying close attention to where they happen. In 2003, decades after the stagecoach story had faded into local lore, a driver was making their way along a narrow, winding road inside the triangle. It was the kind of road where trees closed in tight on both sides, where headlights barely pushed back the darkness, and where seeing another vehicle would have been surprising. The drive was quiet, uninterrupted, until something ahead broke the rhythm of the road. Just beyond the reach of the headlights, a figure crossed into view. It stood roughly 6 feet tall, its body completely covered in black hair, moving upright as it stepped from the tree line and into the open. The moment was brief, barely long enough to register what was being seen, before the figure slipped back into the woods and was gone. Afterward, the driver tried to make sense of what they'd seen. The most reasonable answer came first. Maybe it was a prank, someone in a costume crossing the road at the wrong moment. But even that explanation fell apart the longer it sat. The stretch of road was isolated, miles from anywhere a stunt like that would make sense. There was no reason for anyone to have been out there that late in the night. In the end, the driver reported the encounter, and it joined the record of similar sightings. Another account added to the stories locals still refer to as the Bennington Monster. And that brings us to the question people always ask next. If something like this exists in the woods, something large, fast, and capable of violence, could it explain the disappearances? On the surface, it feels tempting, but the theory runs into problems almost immediately. If a creature were responsible for multiple vanishings, you would expect to find something left behind. Remains, clothing, blood, some physical trace of an attack. And for most of the Bennington Triangle cases, that evidence simply isn't there. There is, however, one case that complicates the picture we've already been tracing, and that's the mysterious death of Carl Herrick. When his body was later recovered, the details stood out in a way that felt uncomfortably familiar. His death was described as being caused by compression, as though he'd been squeezed, and around him were footprints that investigators thought were bear tracks. But what if they weren't bear tracks? We've already talked about how rare it is to be attacked and killed by a black bear in those woods, especially during a time of hibernation. But if Carl was in fact crushed or squeezed to death, could something else, something large and violent, have done it? It's one of the reasons Herrick's case keeps resurfacing whenever people talk about the monster. It feels, to some, like a moment where the stories and the physical evidence briefly overlap. But it doesn't go any further than that. One case, even one this strange, can't carry the weight of decades of vanishings that unfold under wildly different circumstances. At most, the Bennington Monster explains a piece of the triangle's reputation, not the whole of it. And that's where the conversation naturally shifts again. Because once you've walked through the murders, the creatures, and the limits of what those explanations can reasonably cover, another question starts to take shape, one we've already brushed up against in earlier cases. What if the issue isn't what's in the woods, but what happens to people once they're inside them? That's where the idea of sudden displacement enters back into the story. Not an attack, not an abduction, just a break in time and place. We've already seen why Frida Langer is often brought into this part of the discussion. She vanished, and 6 months later her body was found just a few miles away from where she was last seen, in terrain that searchers had already cleared. If she wasn't there when they searched, then she arrived later. But how exactly could she arrive later? Well, if foul play was involved, her body could have been placed there at a later time. Another explanation is that with the colder weather turning and snow on its way, the terrain could have concealed her body even further, which is why initial search efforts didn't find her. Or what if she unknowingly stepped into something that may have pushed her deeper into the woods, where she became disoriented and unable to survive? The same line of thinking has long been applied to James Tedford. He vanished after stepping off a bus in 1949 in broad daylight with other people nearby. But what if he never stepped off the bus? What if there's merit to what witnesses described, seeing James in his seat, asleep, moments before he simply vanished? If displacement is possible here, then he may have ended up somewhere remote, inaccessible, or simply never considered during the search. According to Joseph Citro and other researchers, this is what ties everything together. The triangle may function as a kind of paranormal ground, possibly even a portal, which would explain why aerial phenomena, disappearances, and spatial anomalies overlap within the same geographic boundaries. And importantly, reports like these don't stop in the past. Similar incidents continue into the 21st century, which brings us to the most unsettling possibility of all. If displacement can happen here, then the strongest evidence wouldn't be someone who vanished. It would be someone who vanished and came back. 62 years after Paula Weldon disappeared in 1946, a man hiking near Glastonbury Mountain vanished from the exact same place. By the time we reach the end of this story, the Bennington Triangle no longer feels like something confined to faded newspaper clippings or half-remembered legends passed down over decades. It's a place that feels present and alive. That's why this is where we end. Because 62 years after Paula Weldon disappeared along this same stretch of Vermont wilderness, someone else walked into it, disappeared, and came back. His name is Robert Singley. It's Sunday, September 28, 2008, when 27-year-old Robert Singley kisses his fiancée goodbye just before noon. He tells her that he's going on a hike and will be back home at around 5 p.m. Robert's a music composition teacher at Bennington College and spent much of his free time the way he always had, outside, moving through the woods that folded around the town. It was a hike he'd done before, a route he knew well, enough time to stretch his legs, clear his head, and come back in time for dinner. Robert maps out his hiking route and takes off. He parked along Harbor Road in Woodford Hollow, the same road where Paula Weldon had last been seen walking in 1946, near the Long Trail. He set out expecting a familiar 5-mile loop and nothing more. The climb up Bald Mountain took him about 3 miles. When he reached the top, he stopped to eat the lunch he'd packed and take in the view. It was stunning. Layers of forest rolling away in every direction, broken by pale slabs of white rock catching the light to the west. To the north, Glastonbury Mountain rose in slow, deliberate lines, dark and steady against the sky, as if it had been standing watch long before anyone thought to look back at it. It was one of those early fall days where the world feels momentarily steady, clear skies stretched wide overhead, the air crisp enough to sharpen color and sound, each breath cool and clean. And sitting there, something else began to settle into place. You see, Robert had been stuck on a musical composition. He'd come out here hoping the rhythm of walking might loosen it, let the notes surface on their own without being pushed. And it worked. Sitting on Bald Mountain, the music finally came together. He could hear it clearly now, nearly complete, as if the trail itself had carried it into focus. When he turned back to descend, he expected the walk down to take less than an hour. Downhill always feels quicker, easier. He recognized the trail markers from the way up. The trail looked exactly the way it should have. For the first 10 minutes, nothing felt out of place. At 20 minutes, the woods still moved the way they always had. The music continued in his head, steady and vivid, and he felt that familiar sense of relief that comes with the breakthrough, the quiet satisfaction of something finally clicking. Somewhere around the 30-minute mark, things began to shift. The music didn't stop, but it changed. The tone bent slightly, slipping into something darker, unresolved, like a melody drifting into a minor key suddenly and unexpectedly. It was subtle enough that Robert didn't panic or even consider that he might be lost, because the trail still felt right beneath his feet, familiar in the way it always had. At 45 minutes, he expected to be close to the trailhead. He wasn't. At an hour, it felt like he'd already walked farther than the entire climb up, 4, maybe 5 miles, and still there was no sign of his car. By an hour and 10 minutes, the feeling he'd been trying to ignore finally settled in his chest. Not panic yet, but a quiet, insistent awareness that something about this descent no longer made sense. He was descending, he should have been out of the woods by now. Instead, the trees kept closing in around him, and the last bands of daylight thinned beneath the canopy as the sun dropped, draining color from the forest floor. And then, without warning, it happened. Everything around Robert crescendoed. The atmosphere itself seemed to blur, as if electricity surged through the air. It was brief but disorienting, the kind of sensation that makes you pause without really knowing why. He thought it strange, but kept moving, telling himself it was exhaustion, imagination, anything that could still fit inside a rational explanation. But as the light continued to thin and the sun slid toward the horizon, there was no way to deny it any longer. He was lost, and he didn't even know how. Rather than keep walking blindly and risk making things worse, Robert stopped and tried to think. Almost immediately, fog rolled in, thick, heavy, and fast. The fog is so dense, he can barely see anything at all, except for the faint outline of a maple tree nearby. He moved beneath it and waited, hoping the fog would lift. It didn't. When he reached into his backpack for his headlamp, it refused to turn on. No matter what he tried, it stayed dark. There's an indigenous belief tied to this region, the story of a man-eating stone, a place where stepping wrong could mean being swallowed whole. A portal, another world, standing alone in the fog with night pressing in on all sides. That idea no longer felt distant or symbolic. Robert took inventory. No compass, no phone, no map, a notebook, very little water, a broken headlamp. That night, the moon was a waning crescent, offering no light at all. Once the sun disappeared, the forest went completely black. The temperature dropped. The air turned damp and cold, the kind of late September chill that stings your skin. He had mittens and a hat, but nothing meant for an overnight stay on a mountainside. Back home, 5 o'clock came and went. By 8, his fiancée was calling around campus, her worry turning into panic. By 10, she called the police. Around 10:30 or 11, officers arrived at the trailhead and found Robert's car still parked where he'd left it. Fog wrapped around the area so tightly their flashlights barely cut a few feet ahead. They called out for him again and again, but nothing answered back. It was too dangerous to search any further, so they pulled back, planning to return at first light with canines. Robert spent the night alone. He stopped because continuing didn't feel right. Whatever instinct had been pushing him forward earlier was gone, replaced by the sense that walking any farther would only take him deeper into trouble. He stayed near the tree, moving only when the cold or fatigue forced him to shift his weight. He feels as though he's being tugged by two opposing forces. One felt protective, keeping him anchored beneath cover. The other felt restless, insistent, like it wanted him to move deeper into the woods. He was wet, shivering, unable to sleep, and knew he needed a fire to keep warm. As he searched blindly for kindling, his hands kept brushing against something hard. Bones. He found them again and again. What made it unbearable was the certainty that they hadn't been there earlier, or that he would have noticed them if they had been. And yet, now, in the dark, the ground around him felt like a graveyard. Eventually, after carefully feeling his way through the scattered remains, he gathered enough scraps of wood to build a small fire, tearing pages from his notebook to coax it to life. He sits through the night beside the fire, eyes fixed on the small circle of light it throws against the ground. Beyond it, the woods remain unreadable. Every crack of a branch or movement in the dark pulls his attention outward, his body tightening before his thoughts catch up. There's no clear shape to the fear, just the awareness of how little separates him from whatever might be moving beyond the reach of the flames, and how alone he is in the middle of it. He felt a simple, unmistakable sense that he was being watched, that he was prey. Morning came, and by some miracle, Robert was still alive. When he starts moving again, daylight offers no real relief. The woods don't feel completely unfamiliar in a way he can't quite name. Even in full light, the trail no longer lines up with what he remembers from the day before. He knows he walked these paths, knows their rhythm and shape, yet something feels subtly out of place, as if the mountain itself shifted while he wasn't looking. A sign came into view through the trees, Goddard Shelter, near the peak of Glastonbury Mountain. But how was he so far displaced from where he was yesterday? He was 6 or 7 miles from his car, standing near a peak he should have never been able to reach while hiking downhill. It made no sense for him to be standing on Glastonbury Mountain at all, not when he had been descending Bald Mountain the entire time. To get there, he would have had to descend Bald Mountain, pass his car, and then climb back up toward Glastonbury, despite insisting he'd been following the same trail down. Maps can be confusing, trails can mislead, but hiking downhill doesn't bring you back up a completely different peak. As he followed the signs back toward Bald Mountain and down toward his car, he encountered massive fallen trees blocking the trail, obstacles he was certain hadn't been there the day before. Around 11:30 a.m., after hiking 7 or 8 extra miles without sleep, Robert reached his car. Police were already there with search dogs. They told him the canines had followed his scent, and then it simply stopped. Aside from being cold, wet, and hungry, Robert was physically fine, but what stayed with him was the horror of uncertainty. He admits it's possible he got lost, that he wandered onto a side trail without realizing it. But the accumulation of details never sat right. The shifts in the atmosphere, the way the woods felt altered, the sense that something fundamental had slipped just briefly out of alignment. Some people talk about gateways, others talk about parallel worlds, separated by boundaries that usually hold, except in places like this, where something feels thin, unstable, easier to cross without realizing it, where a familiar path can quietly shift beneath your feet. It's one way to reinterpret the old legend of the man-eating stone, not as something that consumes, but as something that moves people elsewhere. To anyone watching, it would look the same, a person there one moment and gone the next. If that kind of displacement is possible here, it also reframes the stories of cryptids tied to this region, creatures whose tracks end abruptly, who vanish while being watched, as if they step out of the frame entirely. So, was Robert Singley nearly claimed by the Triangle, 62 years after Paula Weldon disappeared along the same road? Or did he simply get lost, caught in a chain of small human mistakes that added up to something terrifying? And if the truth sits somewhere between those two explanations, what does that say about a place that keeps producing stories like this across generations, across circumstances, across decades? That's where we leave it, with the sense that the Bennington Triangle doesn't just take people. Sometimes it lets them come back. And when it does, it never quite lets them return the same way. Now, before we leave this place, it's worth taking one last look at what we've just walked through. We end with Robert Singley making it out alive. Cold, exhausted, shaken, but alive. And that alone forces the question of the Bennington Triangle into focus. Is this place truly something supernatural, or is it simply a stretch of land so unforgiving that even small mistakes are punished without mercy? There is a version of this story that doesn't involve portals or monsters at all, a version where the triangle isn't cursed, just dangerous, where geography, weather, and terrain do most of the damage. The region is known for strange wind patterns, winds that shift quickly, disrupt weather, and disorient anyone caught in them. The same argument has long been made about the Bermuda Triangle. Not that it's supernatural, but that storms and wind systems behave differently there, creating chaos that feels inexplicable from the outside. But there's an important difference. The Bermuda Triangle is open ocean, vast, empty, and largely unwitnessed. The Bennington Triangle isn't. It's full of people, hikers, hunters, campers, moving through it every season. And when something goes wrong here, it doesn't happen in isolation. It happens within reach of trails, camps, roads, and search teams. That doesn't make it safer. It makes the margin for error thinner. Out there, it doesn't take much. A slip, a fall, a wrong step on wet ground. During the search for Mitty Rivers, even the people tasked with finding him weren't spared. One of the searchers, an Army corporal, fell into a river, dislocated his shoulder, and had to be rushed back to base camp. If that can happen to trained servicemen, it's not hard to imagine how quickly things can unravel for someone alone, injured, and unseen. If there's no witness, no immediate rescue, no way to call for help, time turns against you fast. That explanation fits some of these cases. It may even explain what happened to Mitty Rivers. But it doesn't explain all of them. And that's where the ground starts to shift. Frida Langer's case almost feels easier, at least on paper. Her body is eventually found, and exposure and disorientation are enough to explain how she died. But the details still don't fully add up. She's discovered only a few miles from where she was last seen. Search parties had moved through the area repeatedly for months, and if she had been nearby in those early days, close enough to be found later, it's hard to understand how she wouldn't have heard people calling out for her during those searches. Carl Herrick is the case that never actually settles. His body is also recovered. His death is officially labeled a bear attack. But when you actually try to picture that explanation, when you slow down and think through what a bear attack actually looks like, it starts to come apart. Bears maul, they bite, they tear, they leave chaos behind them. They don't squeeze, and yet that's how Herrick's injuries are described. If the reports are accurate, and if it wasn't a bear doing what they say was done to his body, then what exactly killed him? Then there's Paula Weldon. Multiple witnesses place her near Route 9, walking toward the long trail, doing exactly what she said she planned to do. That part holds. What doesn't is everything after it. There are no traces of her beyond that point. No body, no belongings, no more confirmed sightings, no clear path forward. Did she reach the trail? Did she leave the road? Did she get into a car? Nobody knows what happens next, and that's the most haunting thought of all. That's the space where the stranger interpretations live, not as answers, but as possibilities. Serial killers, the Bennington Monster, UFOs, portals, something that doesn't belong here in the usual sense, something that might move through the landscape differently, even briefly crossing into it from somewhere else. And that's why the Bennington Triangle refuses to resolve into a single clean explanation. The grounded theories explain too little, the paranormal ones explain too much. Every time the story starts to lock into place, one detail slips out of alignment. There's too much here that can't be dismissed outright, and too much that can't be proven either. Aliens, portals, monsters, murders, accidents. The triangle leaves room for all of it. And that's what makes it endure. Because whatever this place is, whether it's brutal land, bad luck, or something stranger, it keeps producing stories that don't sit still. And somewhere in all of that wilderness, the truth is out there. That's all for today's episode. If you want to keep up with more stories like this, make sure you're following along on socials at Darkly Speaking Podcast. And if you have a spooky encounter you'd like to share, you can send in your stories and case requests to darklyspeakingpodcast@gmail.com, or you can check out our website, darklyspeakingpodcast.com. Thanks so much for spending your night with me, and I'll see you next week with a brand new episode.